Well, as someone with very few, indeed no letters after my name, hopefully you won't find me to be one of the barbarians. We'll see by the end of the evening here. It's really a great honor to be here to address you on this important topic of science and technology and the common good. And I thank Professor Snell for the very generous introduction and the Agora Institute for extending the invitation. Let me also say up front that I feel a bit out of place coming sandwiched in between lectures by the former Chief Rabbi of England, the Archbishop of Philadelphia, both great men and great leaders. As they used to say on Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other. Indeed, I cannot even call myself the Chief Technology Officer of America or the Arch Scientist of New York. I'll have to settle with Editor-at-Large and a few other much less lofty titles. But perhaps that is part of the point. To govern ourselves in the age of technological modernity, we cannot rely upon scientific knowledge alone. Science cannot teach us how to live well in the age of science. Our technological mastery of nature alone cannot show us how to live well with the moral dilemmas of technological power. We need other sources of wisdom. We need chief rabbis, we need archbishops, and we even need a few amateur humanists like me who take the powers of science seriously but do not worship at the altar of the laboratory, and who appreciate the seemingly godlike benevolence of technology, especially modern medicine, while also confronting the devilish inhumanity to which man's greatest technological inventions can sometimes be put. If I convey nothing else this evening, this point alone is perhaps worth remembering and reflecting upon. Science cannot govern science. We need wisdom, and when wisdom fails, we need the humility to put our faith in the divine hand of redemption. I'd like to explore this subject, science, technology, and the common good, in a very particular way. One that draws upon two sets of experiences, two very difficult dilemmas that have stood at the center of my own work over the past 15 years. The first is the question of embryo research, an issue that dominated our public debate for many years and which we wrestled with during my time at the President's Council on Bioethics. The question we face: should we harvest and destroy human embryos in the pursuit of medical progress? The second issue is the question of a potentially nuclear Iran, which is probably the greatest challenge in world politics today. It is something I wrestled with as the head of a think tank that cares deeply about the future of the Jewish people and the Jewish state, who stand uniquely threatened by Iranian nuclear ambitions. The question we face here is, should America or Israel use military force, use technological power, to prevent the coming of a nuclear Iran, and with it a potential new age of hyperproliferation? Seen together, these two issues, the stem cell question and the Iran question, reveal two different faces of technological modernity. Indeed, they are perhaps the two paradigmatic challenges that modern man, if he seeks also to be a moral man, must confront: the embryo and the atom, the tiny invisible victim dissected in the pursuit of cures, and the possibility of mass visible bloodshed if we fail to pursue a statesmanship that prevents it. In thinking about these issues, I think we begin to see the difficulty, the stakes, and the novelty of trying to secure the common good in the brave new world of technological power. Man lives on the precipice of a new era, and I am afraid that we are well armed, but often morally naked, capable of remaking the world, but often without the wisdom we need to restrain and guide us. But I am one step ahead of myself. Before turning to the embryo and the atom in particular, I should try to say something in general about the idea and the reality of the common good, which is the theme of this lecture series as a whole. What is the common good? Is it simply the aggregated good of every individual, or something that transcends the good of any particular individual? Whose common good matters most? My family, my city, my civilization, my species? Is the common good the same from generation to generation? because human nature is the same from generation to generation? Or does the common good change as our material conditions change, as our self-understanding evolves? What are the greatest threats to the common good, and can they be opposed? These are large questions which have gripped the minds of philosophers, theologians, and statesmen for millennia. I have no illusions that I have much to add to their accumulated wisdom. Studying these questions and thinking about the competing answers to these questions is probably the reason many of you are here at this particular institution seeking a liberal education. So I make no claims or even stab at originality, but simply offer 5 principles about what the common good is to guide the inquiry that follows. First, chaotic violence is the primal enemy of the common good. Without the tranquility of order, to use a good Augustinian phrase, there can be no common good. Now, it is true that heroism often flourishes in periods of chaos, especially the greatness of statesmen and soldiers. And it is true that even ordinary people often live more seriously. They learn the preciousness of life when death and killing and destruction surround them. We must also remember that imperfect man will never achieve perfect order. Chaos, whether man-made or natural, whether the tidal waves of battle or the tidal waves of oceans, always lurks around the corner. Nevertheless, some societies and civilizations have done and still do a much better job at securing a civil society, allowing ordinary people to raise families, to work, and to worship together. A society where children can safely play at playgrounds is better than a society in which children live in underground bunkers. Second, no society that abuses and abandons its weakest citizens can truly claim to be securing the common good. The elderly, the unborn, the disabled, even those whose lives might seem not yet realized or already done, even those whose lives seem diminished, they too possess a dignity and a majesty that demands our care and our protection. Now there is a counter-argument here, and an argument that is not trivial. That the pursuit of the common good, of the greatest heights that a particular civilization might realize, requires sacrificing the weak in the name of our common strength. It is precisely the common good, so this counter-argument goes, that requires us to abandon those who put a drag on the common good. That is the old Greek way of civic excellence. We're all fodder for the polis. To put this in modern existential terms, should the greatest young pianist of her generation really give up her craft to raise a disabled child or care for a demented parent? To put it in modern social terms, should the common good, as manifested in the common purse, be spent largely on benefits for the needy elderly instead of better schools for the promising young? These tensions are real, and they should not be cavalierly dismissed. But in the end, we should affirm, I believe, the principle of equal human dignity and aim to live in a society that shows one face of its greatness by standing always with the weak. Third, the common good requires a culture that promotes moral excellence and that stands against self-degradation, including and perhaps especially victimless forms of self-degradation. The prevailing ethic of our age is that everything is fine between consenting adults so long as no one ends up in the hospital. This is how mainstream culture thinks about sexuality, entertainment, choosing a career, deciding whether or not to have children, choosing a church, or choosing to be churchless. Wise to man's imperfections, friends of liberty rightly recoil at efforts to create a totalitarianism of virtue. And wise to man's imperfections, we need to forgive our worst sins and laugh at our lesser ones. But friends of virtue, especially the idea of a virtuous society, also recognize that our decadence comes at a price, lowering our sights, shrinking our possibilities, turning us into mere pleasure-seeking animals. That is not the common good, because the man who sees the world through the lens of his own pleasure is not truly a part of a common enterprise at all. Human beings, I think, and I hope, can do better. Fourth, a society that does not devote itself to raising up the young, to bringing a new generation of children into the world, and educating them for the serious work, the serious moral and civil work of life, is failing to secure the common good. The common good transcends the generations. It links past, present, and future. A generation that sacrifices the traditions of the past and the possibilities of the future in the name of a happy present is not concerned with the common good. It is like being a runner in a relay race, but never taking the baton from the one before you and never handing it off to the one who follows. Such a runner, however fast, secures no victory, and he dies alone. Finally, societies interested in the common good typically have some larger ideal, some great civilizational purpose or aspiration that transcends the pursuit of individual excellence. The individual is not a means to society's ends. He is not a cog in the machine. He possesses a uniqueness and a dignity as a singular event in history, an I never to be repeated, known and remembered by the eternal creator of all. And yet, that I is defined by his loves. And if there is nothing I love enough to die for, nothing I love more than myself, then I am not a complete I. Family, tribe, nation, God, when the moment of courage comes, if it comes, many will fail to give thyself for the things they love. But the failure of courage is different than the failure of idealism. To fail in loving well under duress is different than loving nothing at all. A true common good is one that inspires individuals to pledge their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to the realization and protection of that higher good, seen as a shared achievement and a shared inheritance. There's much more I could try to say here, but that seems good enough for present purposes, or at least as good as I can do in defining what we mean, or at least what I mean, when speaking about the common good. The tranquility of order, the dignity of every life, opposition to self-degradation, the rearing of the young from generation to generation, and the higher loves that give my life its deepest purpose and meaning, even unto death. Such principles, which can be articulated in the abstract, truly take shape in the concreteness of history, in real decisions faced by real societies and real individuals in particular times and particular places. And for us, living as we do in the age of technological modernity, the decisions we face are novel and consequential. They require us to think about man on a new playing field of possibilities, both for better and for worse. They require us to make moral decisions of a sort and perhaps at a scale that we have never faced before. And it is here that I would like to reflect together on the atom and the embryo. To sharpen that discussion, I would ask you to imagine two realities, a few years into the future, that are not so far-fetched. Let's start with reality number one, with the embryo case, and ask, where do embryos for research come from? Right now, the greatest constraint on the mass production of embryos for research is the availability of human eggs. There are hundreds of thousands of embryos sitting in freezers, originally created by couples during in vitro fertilization, and now left with no real prospects. But most of these embryos are not available for research because the couples themselves are unwilling to donate them. Eager to get pregnant, yearning for a child, they created many embryos at once, so they did not have to keep retrieving eggs every time they wanted to try to get pregnant. But now, having had a child or two, they feel like their family is full, or they are beyond the age of healthy childbearing. But they also feel some connection to their frozen embryos, nascent flesh of their own flesh, and don't know what to do. It is a strange and impossible moral dilemma, a dilemma unique to our own age. Now, from a scientific perspective, it would be much easier and much better to manufacture embryos for research purposes, giving the scientists greater genetic control over the embryos and greater flexibility in the manner and volume of their creation. So imagine a few years from now that we could manufacture eggs using stem cells. With sperm so readily available, this would allow scientists to mass produce human embryos for research. And let us imagine that the science of stem cells progresses, not as the miracle pathway to cures we were once promised, but still as a very promising strategy for making real advances in ameliorating certain terrible diseases, including those that afflict children or that end adult lives prematurely. Should we pursue this new science? Should we build a new era of medicine using human embryos en masse as the barely visible raw materials of progress? That is reality number one, the embryo question. Now to reality number two, the Iran case. Imagine that despite our best diplomatic efforts, Iran's march towards a nuclear weapon proceeds unabated, and the regime itself becomes more radical in its ambitions, fomenting terrorism in the Middle East, asserting leadership over the Muslim world, promising to wipe the state of Israel off the map. And imagine by then that a surgical strike simply against the weapons facilities is now a very uncertain option, because Iran's nuclear program is better hidden, more spread out, and less transparent to our less than adequate intelligence. Imagine, too, that Iran's Arab enemies, including the Saudis and the Egyptians, make clear to us privately that they will immediately go nuclear themselves if and when Iran demonstrates its nuclear capacity, creating the prospect of hyperproliferation in the most volatile political region of the world. What should we do? Should we take military action to topple the regime, knowing that it will cost many lives, American and Iranian alike? And how much added risk should we take to American soldiers if we took such military action to minimize the deaths of Iranian civilians? Should we engage in a massive bombing effort if we believe that was the best way to destabilize the regime and prevent or halt a nuclear Iran? But knowing also, of course, that many Iranian women and children would die. Before thinking this through, let me confess up front my own views and prejudices. I'm against embryo research, and I am for a military strike against Iran, sooner rather than later, to prevent this awful regime from getting the ultimate man-made technological power, which it could use to blackmail and to kill. But my primary purpose here is not to persuade you that I'm right, at least not until the end, but to show the meaning of the four possible positions on the embryo-Iran axis, which demonstrate four very different persuasions about the common good in the age of technological power. So let's start with position A, against embryo research and against military action. This first position might be described in simple terms as never take an innocent life, no matter the consequences. In this view, man is defined by his capacity to love every fellow human being, including embryos without faces, and including those who seek to bring death into the world as an instrument of their political and apocalyptic projects. Man in this view is defined by his relation to the eternal, which is defined by our capacity to love within history. We can always love, so long as we are willing to face the consequences. In this view, to be virtuous, we must be willing to surrender to death. Death by disease, if only killing embryos can save us, and death by war, if only preventive war can save us. Our purpose in life is to bear witness to the possibility of love in a world of darkness. Our posture is not to conquer, but to surrender. To be sure, some who hold this position might believe that God will save us within history, that he will reveal other pathways to a cure like adult stem cells, or that he will moderate the madness of the Iranians before they bring a second Holocaust or worse upon us. But the most honest, most realistic adherents of this persuasion accept that we must accept death to live well, that learning how to die is the work of life, that the technological project, which inflates man's hopes within history and inflates his power to do evil within history, is fundamentally flawed. It is a call to holiness through human meekness. It requires bravery, stoicism, faith, but it also abandons science and statesmanship, the worldly arts, and it accepts that the twisted world of sinful man may only get more twisted even as the faithful bear witness to the possibility of redemption from the woes of mortal life, from which there can be no scientific liberation. The second position is the pro-embryo research, pro-military strike position. This position centers on the vigorous self-defense of technological society. The belief that the technological age is the summit of human power and possibility, that man should seek to conquer disease, to conquer the maladies of mind and body, to extend life in the face of nature's indifference. And it is the belief that those cultures, especially radical religious cultures, which glorify death and submit to a God of power, need to be opposed and defeated. In this view, we are in a struggle between civilization and barbarism, and we have every right to assert our own self-defense. We should celebrate the empire of progress that we have built and defend it bravely and boldly. Empires cannot waste a lot of time worrying about embryos, and civilized peoples who have built temples of science, who have achieved technological miracles, cannot allow their backward enemies to use our own technological inventions against us. So we should use our power to defend our power. And while we should not glorify the death of our enemies, we should not fail to act out of excessive concern for enemy innocence. And we should not compare our use of military force and the collateral damage that it brings with their terrorism, both real and threatened. If Churchill did not act during World War II, if he did not use every plane and bomb and weapon at his disposal to defeat Germany, knowing that many German women and children would die, then Hitler would have won. If we do not act, Iran will win, and we will have the mass graves in Jerusalem or in New York to prove it. In this view, seen positively, technology is the means to achieving the highest human ends, the extension of life, and the maximization of human freedom and human pleasure. Seen defensively, technology is the necessary means for protecting the technological society by giving us the power to defeat those who reject Western modernity. We should never surrender, not to nature and not to a nuclear-armed radical Islam. We should act, and act now. The third position is the pro-embryo research, anti-military action position. This position is what you might call the modern progressive position, or even, if I were being clever, the Cartesian position. It believes that we should move full speed ahead with embryo research, that the amelioration of human suffering is the highest human purpose, and that medicine is the most successful human vehicle for achieving that purpose. Embryos do not suffer, and so they have no claim in our compassion and our protection. And indeed, it is only religious people who falsely claim that embryos are persons, the same religious people who question the modern scientific project as a whole. But those religious people have bizarre priorities. They seek to preserve embryos but are morally deaf to the suffering of the ill and stand in opposition to the very scientific research needed for cures. Those who hold this view, the modern progressive view, want to expand the NIH budget and shrink the Pentagon budget. They have a variety of reasons for rejecting action in Iran. For some, Iranian power seeking is simply a logical Iranian reaction to American power. We Americans are the dominant nuclear power in the world. We are the only ones who have ever actually used nuclear weapons. If we dismantled our arsenal, the rest of the world would have little motivation to arm themselves. For others, the problems of the Middle East are simply insoluble, that they are not our problems. We can build an island of progress, a new Atlantis for ourselves. We should focus on ameliorating the suffering of our own people. We should focus on nation building at home, as epitomized in Obamacare, an effort to spread access to modern medical technology to as many Americans as possible. In this view, we should remain innocent, not killing in the name of seeking peace, but acting peacefully in the name of pursuing progress. The final position, which opposes embryo research and makes the case for a military strike against Iran, is the conservative position. Conservative in the sense of our contemporary politics, but also in the deeper sense of trying to conserve as much good as possible in a world of imperfect and mortal men. This view certainly does not reject the modern technological project, and certainly not the modern medical project. Yet it also recognizes that the belief that man can truly conquer nature, that he can completely relieve his estate, is ultimately utopian. This means man must learn to live well with death, even as he vigorously seeks to improve and extend life. And it means that he must set certain moral limits on the pursuit of cures, the most basic limit being that we do not use some lives as mere things, as raw material in the war against disease. Embryos may not seem like very much, but they are human lives in progress. They are nascent human persons. We should do many things in search of cures. The mass harvesting of the weakest among us should never be one of them. And while there may be things we can justify in moments of crisis, we cannot treat every human disease as a supreme emergency. At the same time, we cannot flee from the responsibilities of history, including the special responsibility we have for the well-being of our own people and of our closest allies. And in the age of technological power, we cannot surrender to those whose values and projects glorify death. In the age of nuclear weapons, this responsibility within history to preserve as much tranquility of order, as much decency and normalcy as possible, becomes only graver and more difficult. Such moral and political realism means accepting that we cannot live innocent lives in a world populated by sinful men. We cannot remain pure in our efforts to protect the more civilized societies, like our own, against the more barbaric ones. This difficult truth was stated lucidly by the great theologian Reinhold Niebuhr in a short essay he wrote in 1943 during the bloody battles of World War II. It is worth quoting at length. Quote, "Every righteous national or political cause is partly guilty of the evil against which it contends. There is no escape from guilt in history. This is the religious fact that St. Paul understood so well and that is so frequently not understood by moralistic versions of the Christian faith. Once bombing has been developed as an instrument of warfare, it is not possible to disavow its use without capitulating to the foe who refuses to disavow it. No man has the moral freedom to escape from these hard and cruel necessities of history. Yet it is possible to express the freedom of man over the necessities of history. We can do these things without rancor or self-righteousness. It has been reported by both American and British authorities that pilots of bombing planes, professing the Christian faith, have sometimes refused to take communion before their perilous trips. This hesitancy does credit to their conscience. They ought, on the other hand, to be helped to understand that the Lord's Supper is not a sacrament for the righteous, but for the sinners, and that it mediates the mercy of God to those who, not only to those who repent of the sins in which they are involved, inexorably by reason of their service to a just cause." And when the story of our age is written, on earth or in heaven, what will the righteous rememberers say? That we erred by action or that we erred by inaction? That our greater guilt was permitting the great powers of death to proliferate, or that we took innocent lives in an earnest effort to prevent an apocalyptic age of man-made, technological, uncontrollable destruction? In the realm of bioethics, I believe we should not simply do anything possible, such as harvest embryos or fetuses for research, in order to stay alive. The mere fact of my mortality, the mere fact of a particular disease, is not a crisis for civilization. Mortality is the human condition. There are some things we should never do in normal times, even if killing 100 fetuses or 100 embryos could save 1,000 lives. But in plague times, I would surely think differently. And I believe that our potential nuclear condition is more like plague times than normal times, that civilization itself might hang in the balance. God help those, the presidents and the prime ministers, who must make such impossible decisions. But to this reasonably informed onlooker, it seems like our window for action, for preserving even the possibility of the common good, may be shrinking. Because once the technological power to kill en masse is available en masse, there will be no more tranquility of order. If we suffer such a fate, the ultimate tragedy of the technological age will be upon us. In seeking through man-made power to become independent of God, in seeking to become the self-sufficient conquerors of nature, the master relievers of man's estate, we may only have God to turn to redeem the man-made darkness, to offer eternal hope amid the chaos of the new nuclear age. God always gets the last word, and whatever redemption he might offer us in such a scenario, it will be as painful to him as bringing the flood. Let me offer one final twist before concluding. In Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, one of the deepest and most important reflections on human life in the age of technology, the reason people accept, nay, seek a world of pleasurable amusements and psychic trivialities, a world of happy pills and televised distractions, is because real life just proved too difficult. What's the point of truth or beauty or knowledge, Huxley writes, when the anthrax bombs are popping all around you? People wanted instead a holiday from the facts, a virtual reality, an artificial life of high-tech pleasures that satisfied our animal appetites and squashed our deeper longings. Do we already live in this brave new world? Can such a people, us, rise to the moral, political, and military challenges of atoms and of embryos? And if we fail, if we do enter a new dark age of technological destruction or technological dehumanization, will we seek our salvation in God or in Soma? Let us hope we never have to answer that question. And in the meantime, as we face an uncertain future, perhaps we can remember what an embryo truly is: a child in the making, a new life to love, a reaffirmation of the goodness of being, and thus the only redemption we can ever know this side of eternity. Thank you.